Attention! This channel provides original historical analysis based on sources and research. We do not simply recount events, we analyze their causes and consequences, explaining them through original narration, editing, and visual diagrams. A list of sources is included in the description. Enjoy watching. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are looking at a real historical event. One decision, made by one man in one night, that changed the outcome of one of the most critical sieges of the Second World War. No mythology, no exaggeration, just the facts, the conditions, and the sequence of choices that determined what happened next. Let's begin. December 1944, minus 13 degrees Celsius. A moonless night over Bastogne in the Belgian Ardennes. One man kneels in the snow, 50 meters from the enemy line, and takes apart a machine gun. He is not fixing it. He is changing it, without orders, without authorization, in a way that military regulations would classify as unauthorized modification of government property. If he is wrong, soldiers die. If he is right, the enemy loses its most reliable tactical advantage. He has until dawn to find out which it is. The man's name was Staff Sergeant Vincent Anthony Spilanza, H Company, 101st Airborne Division, United States Army. The weapon in his hands was a Browning M1919, the primary machine gun of American infantry units throughout the war, chambered in .30-06 Springfield, capable of firing between 400 and 600 rounds per minute. By every official standard, it was a dependable weapon. But dependable and sufficient are two different things, and in Bastogne, on the night of December 21, 1944, the difference between those two words could be measured in lives. The siege had begun 3 days earlier. On December 16th, German forces launched Operation Wacht am Rhein across an 85-mile front in the Ardennes, what history would later call the Battle of the Bulge. The 101st Airborne was rushed from its rest area at Mourmelon-le-Grand, France, loaded onto open trucks in winter darkness, and delivered to Bastogne on the evenings of December 18th and 19th. Many men arrived without full cold-weather equipment. Ammunition loads were below standard. By December 19th, the Germans had encircled the town completely. The garrison was cut off. The numbers were not favorable. American forces defending Bastogne totaled approximately 18,000 men, including the 101st and several attached units. German strength in the encirclement was considerably higher. Artillery ammunition had been rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day by December 21st. Mortar rounds were being counted individually. Supply lines had been severed since December 19th, and there was no immediate prospect of relief. The men were operating on interrupted sleep, cold field rations, and the certainty that another major assault was coming with the morning light. In this context, the M1919's central limitation was not a technical inconvenience. It was a structural problem with direct tactical consequences. The weapon was air-cooled, meaning it relied on ambient airflow to dissipate the heat generated by sustained firing. Army doctrine recommended short bursts of 6 to 9 rounds to prevent overheating. After approximately 200 rounds of continuous fire, barrel temperature reached a point where accuracy degraded measurably, mechanical wear accelerated, and the risk of malfunction rose sharply. The prescribed solution was to halt firing and allow the barrel to cool, a process that took several minutes under ideal conditions and longer under the freezing, physically demanding conditions of a combat position in the Ardennes winter. Several minutes of silence. That phrase carried a specific tactical meaning at Bastogne. German infantry units had been fighting American forces long enough to understand the operational rhythm of crew-served weapons. They knew that machine guns needed to pause. They planned around that pause. Their assault waves were timed and spaced to exploit the cooling intervals, moving forward quickly during the silence, going to ground before fire resumed, then advancing again during the next pause. The silence was not just an absence of fire, it was a signal. It told the attacking infantry when to move. Spilanza had seen this dynamic operate directly in October 1944 during fighting near Veghel in the Netherlands. A German counterattack had pushed his squad into a sustained defensive action. After approximately 180 rounds, the M1919's barrel temperature forced a halt. The Germans moved the moment the gun went silent. Within seconds, the distance that had taken them minutes to cover under fire was being closed rapidly. The position nearly broke before artillery support restored the situation. Spilanza survived that contact, but the mechanical sequence, sustained fire, overheating, forced pause, enemy exploitation, had fixed itself in his understanding as a problem that would repeat until it was solved. The tools he had assembled by the night of December 21st were entirely salvaged. A metal file recovered from an abandoned building, a recoil spring pulled from a destroyed American Jeep, metal fittings stripped from a knocked-out German half-track. None of these items appeared in any armorer's manual as components of an M1919 modification. But they were what existed. The battlefield had produced them, and Spilanza had collected them over weeks, not because he had a complete plan, but because he had a persistent problem and the habit of picking up anything that might eventually be useful. His crewmate, Private First Class Garrett, watched from a few feet away in silence that was increasingly uncomfortable. The concern was rational and clearly expressed. An unauthorized modification performed in darkness at -13 degrees without an armorer present on the unit's primary support weapon was exactly the kind of improvisation that could convert a functional gun into a useless one by morning. Spilanza's response was direct. Help or stay quiet. The attack is coming regardless. Only the gun's behavior is still a variable. What Spilanza was doing in those hours was not impulsive. It was the conclusion of a process that had been running since October. Systematic observation, 2 failed experiments, and 1 critical lesson extracted from a recovered German weapon. The night of December 21st was not the beginning of this story. It was the point at which everything that had been learned was either going to work or wasn't. Dawn would provide the answer. Write in the comments what city you're from and subscribe to the channel. That is the best support you can give us. And we move on. Vincent Spilanza enlisted in the United States Army in 1942, at a time when the military was processing hundreds of thousands of new recruits through an accelerated training pipeline that prioritized volume over precision. The system was not designed to place men where they wanted to be. It was designed to place them where they were needed. Spilanza wanted to be a rifleman, mobile, independent, able to use terrain and individual judgment. The Army had a different assessment. During basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, Spilanza encountered a malfunctioning Browning automatic rifle during a unit exercise. The weapon had been set aside as non-operational. Rather than leaving it, he field-stripped it, traced the malfunction to a specific component failure, located a functional substitute from available materials, reassembled the weapon, and confirmed it was operational. All without a manual, under time pressure, and without being asked to do so. The evaluating sergeant noted the sequence, not the dexterity, the logic. That distinction mattered. A wartime army processing millions of men needed soldiers who could maintain and recover equipment without constant armorer support. The ability to identify a failure point, reason backward to its cause, substitute available materials, and verify the result was a specific and transferable skill. It was also exactly the skill that a machine gun crew leader needed. Spilanza was designated as a machine gunner and assigned to advanced weapons training. His preference for the rifle was noted and set aside. He completed his advanced training at Fort Benning and was assigned the M1919 Browning as his primary weapon. The M1919 had a lineage stretching back to John Browning's original 1917 design, a water-cooled weapon that had proven itself in the final year of the First World War. The 1919 variant adapted that design to air cooling, reducing weight and simplifying logistics at the cost of sustained fire capacity. It had been in continuous American service for 25 years by the time Spilanza first handled one. It was familiar, widely distributed, and thoroughly understood by the Army's maintenance system. By objective standards, the M1919 was a reliable weapon. Belt-fed, chambered in the standard .30-06 Springfield cartridge, accurate at ranges up to 1,000 yards under controlled conditions, and mechanically robust in moderate environments. The Army's institutional confidence in it was not unreasonable. But its design assumptions belonged to a different era. The tactical philosophy underlying the M1919 was built around static positions, deliberate fire control, and the consistent availability of armorers, spare parts, and cooling intervals. In the fluid, undersupplied conditions of late 1944 in Western Europe, those assumptions did not hold. The fundamental constraint was thermal. Air cooling meant the barrel absorbed and retained heat generated by combustion. The Army's doctrine of short 6 to 9 round bursts was not arbitrary conservatism. It reflected the actual physical behavior of the steel alloy used in the barrel under rapid, repeated firing cycles. Sustained fire beyond approximately 200 rounds raised barrel temperature to the point where metal expansion affected accuracy, accelerated wear on moving components, and increased the probability of a malfunction. The prescribed remedy was barrel replacement, swapping the hot barrel for a cool spare and resuming fire within a controlled interval. On paper, barrel replacement was a complete solution. In the field, it was conditional on 4 simultaneous requirements: a spare barrel, heat-resistant gloves, adequate light to perform the swap safely, and several minutes during which the position did not need to fire. In the Netherlands, in the autumn of 1944, and later in Belgium, Spilanza's unit consistently lacked at least one of those 4 elements. The solution the manual described existed in a supply environment that the front line did not have. After the October 1944 engagement near Wegel, where his squad's forced cooling pause had allowed German infantry to close the distance and nearly breach the position, Spilanza began a more structured investigation of the M1919's failure mechanics. He requested access to damaged weapons recovered from the field and examined them systematically. He read the maintenance manual not as a set of operating instructions, but as a description of the weapon's thermal and mechanical behavior. He questioned unit armorers about heat distribution patterns and component failure sequences. He was mapping the problem, identifying where it was solvable and where it was not. In early November 1944, he made his first modification attempt. The target was the barrel jacket, the perforated metal sleeve enclosing the barrel. He reasoned that adding ventilation apertures would increase airflow and accelerate cooling. The principle was directionally correct. The execution was not. Additional holes, placed without precise attention to airflow dynamics, created uneven cooling gradients across the barrel's length. Different sections of the metal expanded at different rates. The resulting thermal stress warped the barrel geometry. The weapon failed in under 50 rounds. Lieutenant Robert Walsh, the unit commander, issued a formal warning. Unit weapons were not experimental platforms. If a modification caused a weapon to fail during contact, the position lost its fire support and the men in it paid the price. Spilanza accepted the warning, restored the weapon to standard configuration, and stopped experimenting, temporarily. In mid-November, working quietly and without announcement, he made a second attempt. This time, the focus was the gas system. The M1919's operating cycle relied on gas pressure to cycle the bolt. Adjusting the gas port geometry could alter the firing rate, and a lower firing rate meant less heat generated per unit time. Using a precision file recovered from an abandoned watchmaker's shop in a Belgian village, he reshaped the gas port. Temperature measurements taken informally during test firing showed a measurable reduction, but at approximately 100 rounds, the feed mechanism began producing jams. A feed malfunction in a machine gun is categorically more dangerous than an overheating pause. Overheating stops the gun temporarily, A feed jam stops it immediately, unpredictably, and with no rapid recovery option under fire. He restored the original configuration before the modification was detected. By late November 1944, Spilanza had reached a conclusion more important than either failed experiment had produced. The problem could not be solved by adjusting one variable in isolation. The M1919's thermal behavior, gas dynamics, firing rate, and mechanical reliability were interconnected. Improving one characteristic at the expense of another did not solve the failure. It relocated it. What he needed was a modification that addressed multiple variables simultaneously, balancing them against each other rather than optimizing any single one. To find that balance, he needed a working example. He would find it, weeks later, in the wreckage of an enemy weapon recovered from the snow. On December 10, 1944, a patrol operating near the Dutch-Belgian border returned with something beyond its standard intelligence value. Among the items recovered from a skirmish site was a knocked-out German machine gun, belt torn, barrel still carrying residual heat despite prolonged exposure to the snow, but structurally intact. No catastrophic damage. No deformation that would indicate the weapon had been destroyed rather than simply abandoned. It was an MG-42, and it had clearly been fired extensively before it was lost. Spilanza examined it before it was handed up the chain for formal collection. He was not the only soldier present, and the weapon was not his to keep. But he had approximately 20 minutes with it, and he used those 20 minutes differently than the men around him. Most soldiers who encountered a captured enemy weapon noted its mechanical differences with professional interest and moved on. Spilanza was looking for something specific, a solution to a problem he had been working on for 2 months without success. The MG-42 had entered German Wehrmacht service in 1942 and had already acquired a distinctive reputation among Allied infantry by late 1944. Its cyclic rate of approximately 1,200 rounds per minute, nearly double that of the M1919, produced a tearing sound unlike any other weapon on the battlefield. American and British soldiers had developed informal names for it that reflected both familiarity and respect. But what Spilanza focused on was not the rate of fire. It was the physical condition of the weapon after that rate of fire. A gun capable of 1,200 rounds per minute generates thermal stress at an extraordinary rate. Yet the barrel jacket in front of him showed no signs of the warping or failure that his own experiments had produced at far lower firing rates. That discrepancy was the information he needed. The explanation lay in the geometry of the barrel jacket itself. The MG-42's jacket was not simply punched with ventilation holes in a uniform pattern. It was engineered with angled slots oriented to create a specific airflow path. Cooler ambient air drawn in at one end of the jacket, passed longitudinally across the barrel surface, and expelled as heated air at the opposite end. The effect was not passive ventilation, but directed convection. The barrel still reached high temperatures. It was designed to do so, but the heat moved through the metal in a controlled, even distribution rather than concentrating at specific points. Even thermal loading across the barrel's length meant the metal expanded uniformly. Stress was distributed rather than localized, and the weapon remained structurally sound far longer than its firing rate would otherwise suggest possible. Spilanza understood immediately why his November experiments had failed. The additional holes he had cut into the M1919's barrel jacket in early November had increased total ventilation area without controlling airflow direction. The result was random convection, some areas cooling faster than others, creating differential expansion that stressed the metal asymmetrically. The warp he had observed at under 50 rounds was not a consequence of too much modification. It was a consequence of undirected modification. The principle he had been missing was not more airflow, it was organized airflow. The MG-42 also incorporated a rapid barrel change mechanism that allowed a trained crew to replace a hot barrel in approximately 6 to 8 seconds, an engineering solution that effectively eliminated the cooling pause entirely by substituting a cool barrel for a hot one at the moment of need. Spilanza noted this feature and set it aside as irrelevant to his situation. Replicating a precision quick-change mechanism with a file and salvaged metal was not possible. What was possible was approximating the directional ventilation geometry, not with the precision of a factory, but with enough accuracy to produce a meaningful improvement in heat distribution. Imperfect execution of a correct principle would still outperform perfect execution of an incorrect one. 6 days after that patrol, on December 16th, the German offensive began. Operation Wacht am Rhein committed 3 German armies across an 85-mile front in the Ardennes, targeting a sector held by American divisions that were either resting after heavy combat or had limited frontline experience. The line fractured in multiple locations within the first 24 hours. Bastogne, a junction point where 7 major roads converged, became the immediate strategic priority for both sides. German armored columns needed those roads to sustain their advance westward. The American command understood that holding Bastogne would constrain German mobility across the entire central Ardennes sector. The 101st Airborne Division was mobilized from its rest area at Mourmelon-le-Grand, France, and transported to Bastogne in open trucks during the nights of December 17th and 18th. The movement was conducted under time pressure that precluded full equipment loading. Cold weather clothing had not been fully distributed to all personnel. Ammunition was below standard allocation. The division arrived, took up positions around the town perimeter, and began receiving probing attacks almost immediately. By December 19th, German forces had completed the encirclement. The garrison was isolated, and there was no confirmed timeline for relief. H Company was positioned on the eastern perimeter, facing elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division with 2nd Panzer Division assets in support behind them. The force ratio around Bastogne placed approximately 18,000 American defenders against German encircling strength that was considerably higher in both manpower and armored assets. The American defensive advantage derived from interior lines, the ability to shift forces laterally within the perimeter faster than the Germans could reposition outside it, and from terrain that limited the effectiveness of German armor in direct assault on prepared positions. By December 21st, ammunition rationing had reached a level that changed the tactical calculus for every weapon system in the garrison. Artillery was allocated 10 rounds per gun per day. Mortar rounds were being inventoried individually before each defensive action. In this environment, the M1919's forced cooling pause carried a cost beyond its immediate tactical consequence. Every minute of silence was not just an opportunity for German infantry, it was a waste of the window in which ammunition could have been used to stop an attack at distance rather than at close range. Stopping an assault at 300 yards consumed far fewer rounds than stopping it at 50. The cooling pause was converting a resource problem into a survival problem. It was at 2300 on December 21st that Spilanza began the modification. The materials were assembled: the metal file, the jeep spring, the punctured canteen, the rubber tube. The approach was defined by 3 simultaneous interventions. Directional ventilation slots filed into the barrel jacket at calculated angles, replicating the convective airflow principle observed on the MG-42. A replacement recoil spring reducing the cyclic rate from approximately 500 to 450 rounds per minute, decreasing heat generation per unit time without reducing fire density below a tactically useful threshold. And a gravity-fed drip system mounting the canteen above the barrel's hottest point, delivering water at a controlled rate to the metal surface, where it would evaporate and carry heat away through phase change rather than conduction. The drip cooling concept came from a specific source: a story Spilanza's grandfather had recounted about improvised cooling methods used by machine gun crews in the First World War, where water was splashed onto overheated barrels as a field expedient when formal coolant systems failed. The physics underlying that practice had not changed. Evaporative cooling was real, measurable, and required no specialized materials. It required a container, a controlled aperture, and water that had not yet frozen. At -13 degrees, the last requirement was a variable Spilanza could not fully control. He positioned the canteen and accepted the risk. The work took 4 hours. At 3 o'clock on December 22, 1944, he set down the file and looked at the assembled weapon. The exterior was visibly non-standard. Slot marks on the jacket, a canteen mounted above the receiver with tubing running to the barrel surface, internal components that no armorer's manual described. It was not a clean piece of work, but it was not meant to be clean. It was meant to fire continuously for longer than the standard weapon could. Whether it would do that was a question with only one possible answer: the next German attack, which would come with the morning. At 6:45 on December 22, 1944, German artillery opened on the eastern perimeter of Bastogne. The barrage was not designed to destroy prepared positions. The Germans understood that 15 minutes of shellfire against dug-in infantry rarely produced decisive results. Its purpose was suppression. Force the defenders into their foxholes, break observation, severe communication between positions, create a window of disorientation that the following infantry could exploit before the defenders fully reoriented. The psychological effect of preparation fire is distinct from its physical damage. A soldier pressed flat against frozen ground, unable to observe, unable to communicate, unable to do anything except absorb concussion and wait, exits that state with his alertness degraded and his instincts pulling toward readiness. The moment the shelling stops, the natural response is to exhale, to register that the immediate danger has passed. That instinct is predictable, and experienced attacking infantry plan around it. The Germans began moving the moment their own artillery lifted. Spilanza's position on the eastern perimeter had been established with a specific tactical geometry. It was not oriented to face the expected German axis of advance directly. It was angled across it, positioned to deliver enfilade fire along the length of the attacking formation rather than into its front. In a defensive situation where the garrison was numerically inferior, frontal fire consumed more ammunition for less effect than fire delivered across the flank of a moving formation. Enfilade fire struck soldiers who had no cover from that direction, disrupted unit cohesion along the entire wave simultaneously, and forced commanders to choose between maintaining momentum and seeking protection from a threat their approach had not accounted for. At 700, as the artillery smoke began to thin and visibility across the open ground improved marginally, the 1st German infantry became visible at approximately 400 yards. The formation was organized into 3 successive waves, totaling an estimated 600 men. Their movement reflected training and experience, consistent spacing between soldiers, deliberate use of available terrain features, a pace that was neither a rush nor a cautious crawl. These were soldiers executing a practiced assault approach, and that approach rested on a specific calculation. American machine guns would deliver short bursts, pause to manage heat, and during those pauses, the distance could be closed in increments. Each company opened fire across its entire front simultaneously. Rifles, Browning automatic rifles, mortars, and multiple M1919 positions engaged at the same moment. The other M1919 crews operated according to standard doctrine: controlled bursts, deliberate pauses to allow barrel cooling, fire management that preserved the weapon's mechanical integrity at the cost of continuous suppression. This was not incorrect. It was precisely what the weapon was designed to do, and those crews were executing their training accurately. Spilanza did not follow that pattern. He opened with sustained fire and held it, 45 continuous seconds, approximately 300 rounds delivered without interruption along his enfilade arc. Under standard configuration, that duration of fire would have driven barrel temperature into the range where accuracy degradation became significant and malfunction probability increased sharply. The modified M1919 registered none of those effects. The directional ventilation slots moved air across the barrel surface in a managed convective flow, distributing thermal load evenly rather than allowing heat to concentrate at specific points. The drip system delivered water to the barrel's highest temperature zone at the rate Spilanza had calibrated the night before, enough to produce meaningful evaporative cooling without generating steam that would obstruct his sightline or freeze in the sub-freezing air before reaching the metal. The reduced cyclic rate, produced by the salvaged recoil spring, lowered the number of combustion events per second and reduced total heat generation per unit time. All three elements functioned simultaneously, and their combined effect was the result Spilanza had calculated but could not confirm until this moment. The gun did not stop. The first German wave began breaking apart before it reached 200 yards. The enfilade arc meant that soldiers falling under fire created an obstacle for those following behind. Not a physical barrier, but a disruption to the visual and spatial references that soldiers in a moving formation use to maintain direction, spacing, and pace. The second wave encountered the debris of the first and lost the clean approach geometry their training assumed. Individual soldiers began making independent decisions, seeking cover, slowing, deviating from the assault axis, rather than maintaining the collective momentum that makes a wave attack effective. An assault formation is not simply a collection of armed men moving in the same direction. It is a system that depends on each element reinforcing the behavior of the others. Remove that coherence, and the system degrades faster than its individual components. By 7:15, the first wave had broken and survivors were withdrawing. At that point, several M1919 positions in H Company's sector interrupted fire due to barrel temperature, a predictable outcome of standard operation, and not a failure by any technical measure. Those weapons had performed exactly as their design specified. What distinguished Spilanza's position was the absence of any such interruption. His gun had fired through the entire engagement from opening to conclusion without a single cooling halt. That fact was visible in the ground in front of his position, in the distance at which the attack had been stopped, and in the unbroken continuity of the fire that had stopped it. Captain James Roberts reached the position at approximately 7:45. He was an experienced combat officer, and his initial assessment of the weapon in front of him was immediate and accurate. The barrel jacket carried visible file marks. A punctured canteen was mounted above the receiver with tubing leading to the barrel surface. The internal components did not match the standard M1919 parts list. This was not an armorer's authorized modification. This was a field improvisation conducted without supervision on a unit weapon, which under standard military regulations constituted unauthorized alteration of government property. The disciplinary framework for such actions was clear. Roberts did not begin with that framework. He looked at the ground in front of the position first. The distribution of the engagement's results, where the attack had been stopped, at what range, with what consistency, told him something the regulations did not account for. Standard burst fire doctrine would not have produced those results. The attack had been broken at a distance that required sustained, uninterrupted fire coverage. The evidence of what had happened was lying in the snow 200 yards out, and it did not align with what a standard M1919 was capable of producing. He asked Spilanza two questions in direct sequence. What did you do to it, and can it be repeated on the other weapons? Spilanza answered both without qualification or justification. He described each element of the modification, the reasoning behind it, the two earlier failures that had preceded it, and the specific risks associated with imprecise execution of the ventilation cuts or incorrect drip rate calibration. Roberts listened to the full account before responding. His decision, reached without reference to regulations and entirely within the logic of the tactical situation, was to order a controlled field evaluation that afternoon. The armorers would test the modification under measurable conditions. If it was reproducible, the question of authorization became secondary to the question of necessity. The field evaluation began at 1400 on December 22nd in a partially collapsed building 40 meters behind the forward line. The location was chosen deliberately, close enough to the perimeter that weapons could be returned to position quickly if the situation changed, far enough back that the test firing would not be misread by adjacent units as a contact engagement. Two M1919s were positioned side by side on improvised rests. One was in standard factory configuration. The other carried every modification Spilanza had applied the previous night. The armorers who gathered around them were professionals with formal weapons training, and their first assessment of the modified weapon was straightforwardly negative. The workmanship was visibly rough. The ventilation cuts in the barrel jacket were uneven in width and spacing, the product of a hand file operated in near total darkness at sub-freezing temperature, not a machinist's tool operating on a stable bench. The drip system was improvised at a level of crudeness that under any normal evaluation criteria would have disqualified it from further consideration. A punctured canteen, a length of rubber tubing, a mounting bracket made from bent metal stripped off a destroyed vehicle. None of this resembled authorized military hardware. The armorers said so, directly and without softening their assessment. Then they asked for a live fire test before forming a final conclusion. That request reflected professional integrity. Judgment based on appearance rather than performance was not useful in any environment, and it was actively dangerous in this one. Both weapons fired at the same target, with identical belt-fed ammunition at the same sustained rate. The standard M1919 reached a barrel temperature requiring an interruption after approximately 200 continuous rounds, consistent with established performance data and precisely what the Army's doctrine predicted. The modified weapon continued without interruption until approximately 600 rounds had been expended, at which point it reached a comparable thermal threshold. The difference was not marginal. Sustained fire capacity had increased by a factor of roughly 3. The armorers recorded the result in plain language and set aside their reservations about the quality of the workmanship. The relevant question had shifted from whether the modification looked acceptable to whether it could be taught. Spilanza walked through the procedure in full detail, treating the armorers as the technically qualified audience they were. He described the ventilation slot geometry, the specific angle and orientation required to generate directional convective airflow rather than the random ventilation that had caused his first experiment to fail in November. He explained the file technique needed to produce that geometry without creating stress concentration points at the edges of the cuts, which would accelerate jacket fatigue under sustained firing vibration. He described the spring dimensions that reduced cyclic rate to approximately 450 rounds per minute, the threshold below which heat generation per unit time dropped meaningfully without reducing fire density to the point where suppressive effect was lost. He addressed the drip system with equal precision. The canteen mounting position was not arbitrary. It placed the water delivery point directly above the section of barrel that reached peak temperature earliest under sustained fire. The aperture size determined drip rate, and drip rate had to be calibrated within a specific range. Too slow, and the evaporative cooling effect was negligible. Too fast, and the water accumulated rather than evaporating, producing steam that obscured the gunner's sight line and, in sub-freezing ambient conditions, risked freezing on the barrel surface before it could evaporate, which would thermally shock the metal rather than cool it. Every element had a failure mode, and every failure mode had a corresponding correction. He explained both for each component. The armorers pushed back on the long-term structural implications of the barrel jacket cuts. Stress distribution around an irregular cut in a metal component under vibration load is not uniform. The edges of an imprecisely cut slot become initiation points for fatigue cracks under the cyclic stress of sustained firing. Over time, a jacket modified this way would fail earlier than an unmodified one. Spilanza's response was precise. The modification reduced component lifespan, and under garrison conditions or in a training environment with reliable resupply, that would be a decisive argument against it. In Bastogne, on the fourth day of a siege with no resupply and no prospect of replacement parts arriving on any predictable schedule, the relevant question was not how long the jacket would last. It was whether the gun would function during the next attack. Those were different questions, and they had different answers. By 1700, the evaluation had produced a conclusion. Roberts submitted the results to battalion command the same evening. The battalion commander reviewed the test data and authorized sector-wide implementation before nightfall. The authorization was notable in its speed and in what it bypassed. Standard Army procedure for modifying issued weapons required Ordnance Department review, formal evaluation trials, and documented approval before any change could be implemented at unit level. That process, under normal administrative conditions, required weeks. The battalion commander did not have weeks. He had the next morning. On December 24th, General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding officer of the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, visited the eastern perimeter in person. McAuliffe had delivered his famously brief response to a German surrender demand earlier that same day. A single word that would be quoted for decades afterward. But the purpose of his visit to the forward line was not ceremonial. He needed a direct assessment of the garrison's physical condition, ammunition state, weapon serviceability, the realistic capacity of the positions to absorb another major assault without external support. Roberts briefed him on the December 22nd engagement and the evaluation results. He presented the modified M1919 directly. McAuliffe examined it and asked the same questions Roberts had asked 24 hours earlier, the practical ones, not the regulatory ones. His direction, as recorded in subsequent after-action documentation, was unambiguous. Modify every M1919 in the sector that could be safely retrieved and returned to position. The instruction did not reference the standard modification approval process because, in the conditions then existing at Bastogne, that process had no operational relevance. Between December 24th and 27th, Spilanza established a field modification station in a fortified basement position set back from the forward line. He organized the work as a production sequence rather than a series of individual jobs. The modification was divided into discrete steps: barrel jacket slot cutting, gas port adjustment, recoil spring replacement, drip system fabrication and installation, function verification, and each step was assigned to a specific individual based on demonstrated aptitude. Standardizing the sequence reduced variability between weapons and allowed less experienced personnel to contribute reliably to specific stages without needing to understand the complete modification. Of the 24 M1919s assigned to the sector, 19 were modified by the evening of December 24th. The remaining 5 were in positions too exposed or too distant to bring in safely during hours of darkness. The throughput, approximately 4 weapons per day under combat conditions with improvised tools in a building without heat by men operating on accumulated sleep deprivation, represented a significant practical achievement. More importantly, it represented a structural change in the defensive line's capability. On the morning of December 23rd, at 5:30, German forces launched a larger assault than the previous day, estimated at 800 infantry, attacking before dawn in a more dispersed formation with shorter individual rushes and heavier mortar support. The tactical adjustments were clear evidence that the December 22nd engagement had been analyzed and its lessons incorporated into the next attack plan. The fundamental assumption, however, had not changed. American machine guns could not sustain continuous fire. The silence would come. The window would open. By 05:45, 4 modified M1919s were simultaneously in action across overlapping fire sectors, delivering a combined sustained rate of approximately 1,800 rounds per minute. The attack stalled before reaching 150 yards from the American line. By 6:15, the German advance had collapsed completely, and withdrawal had begun in disorder. The assault plan of December 23rd had been built on a premise about American weapon limitations that was no longer accurate. The silence the Germans had planned to exploit did not arrive. The window they expected to open remained closed. On December 26, 1944, at approximately 1645, the first vehicles of General George Patton's Third Army, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division, advancing from the south through Assenois, broke through the German encirclement and reached Bastogne. The corridor was narrow, contested on both flanks, and far from secure. But it was open. After 8 days of complete isolation, the garrison had physical contact with the rest of the Allied line. The siege, as a closed encirclement, had ended. What had not ended was the fighting. German command understood immediately what an open corridor represented and responded with pressure on both flanks within hours of the breakthrough. The tactical logic was straightforward. A supply route that had just been forced open under fire was at its most vulnerable in the first hours of its existence. The forces that had opened it were extended, their flanks exposed, their momentum partially spent. If American fire density along the perimeter dropped at that moment, if the defenders, after 8 days of siege, allowed their alertness to fall in response to the arrival of relief, the corridor could be closed again before a single supply truck had completed the journey. The modified M1919 positions on the eastern perimeter continued operating through this transition period without the cooling interruptions that standard weapons would have required. This was not incidental. The hours immediately following Patton's breakthrough were precisely the hours during which the garrison was most susceptible to a psychological relaxation of its defensive posture. The guns that did not pause enforced a continuity of coverage that the situation demanded. The perimeter held its integrity through the transition. The corridor stayed open long enough for the first resupply convoys to reach the town. The chain of cause and effect that had governed 8 days of defensive operations at Bastogne was, in its structure, simple. A gun that maintained continuous fire held a position. A position that held kept a road segment clear. A clear road allowed resupply. Resupply sustained the garrison through the following night. Each link in that chain was dependent on the one before it, and the first link, the sustained fire capacity of the weapons on the perimeter, had been materially strengthened by a modification made with a file and a salvaged spring in a frozen foxhole on the night of December 21st. The scale of that initial intervention and the scale of its ultimate effect were not proportional in any conventional sense. That disproportion is one of the defining characteristics of decisions made at critical points in military operations. Following the relief of Bastogne and the eventual stabilization of the Ardennes front in late January 1945, the 101st Airborne's after-action documentation was compiled and forwarded through standard channels. The field modification to the M1919 was described in technical terms in those reports. The ventilation geometry, the spring substitution, the drip cooling system, the measured performance difference between modified and standard weapons. The reports reached Army Ordnance and the Army Ground Forces Evaluation Board, where they were reviewed by engineers and weapons specialists who had access to laboratory testing resources and precision measurement tools that had not been available in Bastogne's basements. The formal evaluation confirmed what the field test had shown. The modification produced a reproducible and meaningful improvement in sustained fire capacity under cold weather conditions, with a component lifespan cost that was acceptable given the operational conditions in which it was intended to be applied. The assessment was measured in its language, as formal technical evaluations characteristically are. Its conclusion was not. In early 1945, The modification procedure was incorporated into a supplementary technical bulletin distributed to unit armorers across the European theater of operations. A technique developed without authorization by a staff sergeant during a siege had become, within approximately 6 weeks of that siege's conclusion, an officially documented and officially distributed procedure available to every qualified weapons mechanic in the theater. The Ordnance Department did not order the M1919's production lines retooled to incorporate the modifications as factory standard features. The reasoning was practical rather than dismissive. The war in Europe was entering its final phase, production schedules were fixed, and the logistical disruption of mid-production design changes outweighed the marginal benefit of factory-applied modifications to weapons that were already being manufactured and distributed at scale. The technical bulletin was the appropriate instrument. It allowed units already equipped with standard weapons to apply the modification in the field, using the same method and the same materials that had proven effective at Bastogne. The transition from unauthorized field improvisation to officially distributed technical procedure was not an automatic consequence of the modification's effectiveness. It required a specific sequence of human decisions, each made under pressure, each choosing operational utility over procedural regularity. Defer. McAuliffe had chosen to direct defer. McAuliffe had chosen to direct immediate implementation rather than wait for formal approval. Remove any one of those decisions from the sequence, and the modification remains a single incident in one company's sector, unreplicated and undocumented. The presence of all 4 decisions in succession transformed it into something the military system could absorb and redistribute. Spilanza received no decoration specifically linked to the modification. His service record from the Bastogne period contains performance citations appropriate to his rank and role, but the modification itself does not appear as a distinct entry. This outcome is consistent with how military organizations typically process individual technical contributions made below the level of command decision. The work that determines whether a defensive line holds is rarely the work that generates formal individual recognition. Recognition accrues to actions that are visible and attributable at the moment they occur. The effect of a sustained fire capability on a defensive line's integrity is distributed across time and across multiple engagements. It cannot be attached to a single moment or a single name in the way that a visible act of valor can be. Spilanza's contribution was real, and its consequences were measurable. It simply did not take a form that the recognition system was designed to capture. The M1919 Browning remained in American service for nearly 2 decades after the Second World War. It served in Korea, where the cold weather performance limitations that Spilanza had encountered in Belgium reappeared under similar climatic conditions. It appeared in Cold War-era training contexts through the late 1950s and into the 1960s. The fundamental design constraint, air cooling, thermal accumulation, limited sustained fire window, was eventually addressed not by modifying the M1919, but by replacing it with weapons designed from the beginning around different thermal management principles. The problem Spilanza identified in 1944 was ultimately resolved by engineers in design facilities, working with materials and manufacturing processes that had no equivalent on the front line of the Ardennes. That resolution came a decade after Bastogne. In December 1944, the engineers were not in the foxholes and the factories were not in Belgium. What was present was a staff sergeant who had spent 3 months studying a specific failure, who had failed twice in attempting to correct it, who had extracted a principle from an enemy weapon examined in deteriorating winter light, and who had spent 4 hours in the dark translating that principle into a functional modification with tools that no armorer's manual would have recognized as adequate. The gun did not stop. The line held. The road stayed open. These are the documented facts of what happened at Bastogne in December 1944. The sequence connecting them is the history. That is where this story ends. A staff sergeant with a file, a salvaged spring, and 3 months of careful thinking changed the defensive capacity of an entire sector during one of the most critical sieges of the Second World War. No special resources, no factory, no authorization, just a specific problem studied until it had a solution. If you found this history useful, subscribe to the channel. That is the most direct way to support this work. We will be back with the next one.